Please join me in a warm round of applause for Amy Ashby and Lindbergh Matillano to talk about SaaS at scale.
Welcome to one of the last sessions of the conference. Hope everybody's staying awake. I'm Amy Ashby. I work at UnderArmour as a FinOps Lead, and I'm really excited about talking about this topic because I spend, probably about a third of my time managing SaaS. So, Lindbergh?
Great, thanks, Amy. Hi, my name is Lindbergh Matillano. You guys probably saw my name and thought I was a tall German Italian, and now you have a short Asian dude. So, I'm the director of cost optimization at Avalara, and for those that aren't familiar with Avalara, you probably bought something using Avalara's technology. So if you're at Starbucks or on Amazon, you see that little tax calculation there. We calculate that tax, so don't throw anything at us. Our CTO says we're probably one of the largest unknown companies out there. All right, so thank you guys for attending this conference. So just want to talk through and put into context SaaS. So there are a few metrics out there regarding SaaS waste. So you can see this here, about over 30% of desktop and software and SaaS is wasted. 50% of all installed software went unused, and there's projected 25% overspending in SaaS by 2026. How many of you feel that this number is low? Just raise your hand. Pretty good portion of you. I think a lot of you probably have done a lot of looking at your SaaS and realize, wow, there's a lot of waste there. So we hope to go through this presentation and share some of our learnings related to how we manage SaaS. So what is SaaS? Essentially, SaaS, and most of you know this, is software that is presented as a service. It's usually owned, delivered, managed remotely by one of your providers. And a majority of your software is probably delivered via SaaS nowadays. So how do the cloud and SaaS relate? Right, so more and more SaaS is looking more like cloud, where you're essentially usage-based. You're either a user, and we're finding that there's an intersection of the FinOps framework with ITAM. And as you guys saw in the keynote, there's a new ally in there. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who has led our working group on ITAM, to talk about that.
Yeah, so some of you might have heard of our ITAM and FinOps working group. It's sort of talking about the intersections and how we can collaborate and help each other. So the working group is now come to a close after over a year's worth of work. And we produced a bunch of content. The QR code would take you to one of our pieces of content that shows how we intersect with all the capabilities. And the refresh of the framework now includes that licensing and SaaS as a capability, in addition to getting the ITAM persona added as an allied persona. So even though the working group has officially closed, we still have a special interest group, and we meet monthly, and we will continue to create new content, update the existing content that we've created, and keep talking about how important it is for us to collaborate between ITAM and FinOps. So before we even really get into things, it's interesting for Lindbergh and I to get together today because how we manage SaaS is very different. In my organization, we don't have a central FinOps team. Pretty much all of the SaaS software purchased is owned by a business unit, and it's really kind of looked after at a business unit level. So there really isn't a central tool or process beyond getting it purchased. And so, that presents its own set of challenges for sure. And, we have to come up with creative solutions to that based on sort of what your organization is doing. And Lindbergh has got a completely different experience with that.
Thanks, Amy. So at Avalara, the FinOps program obviously falls under what we call cost optimization. And in the past, we essentially just manage our engineering spend. And just recently, the IT software ended up being reorged into our FinOps program. So now we have roughly 60% of our entire software spend directly managed by one organization. So how many of you have, just by raise of hands, how many of you have a centralized IT asset management service? Great. And how many of you have less than 50% or more than 50% of your SaaS managed by one organization? All right. I'm just collecting some stats so when I can bring that back to my director. So there's definitely advantages to having a centralized service. You can essentially direct your business stakeholders to talk, and how they invest things and identify waste and reclaim it. So we're going to just kind of talk through that. So these are essentially 4 common SaaS pricing models. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. You got the user-based, per user, which is probably the most common. You have usage-based, which is essentially pay-as-you-go and metered billing. And then you have freemium, which I think is probably just as common as user-based, but it's also the most nefarious, right? People think it's free, they use it, they install it, and then they realize there's a paywall for that advanced feature that you really, really have, which is most likely SSO, right? So that becomes a challenge. And then you have your historical perpetual licenses, which I think just in general have now kind of fallen to the wayside as more companies move over to SaaS. So you can see what's the main drawbacks across all of these is essentially shelfware. And with the added benefit of freemium, you have definite audit risks. How many of you, raise of hands, have gotten an email from one of these freemium software saying, hey, this license is actually not for personal use and you need to pay for the commercial version? How many of you guys, that's an always fun conversation, right? And you're running around trying to identify all the users. So that's definitely a challenge. So these are the examples of the various pricing models. These are companies that are on those pricing models. So you guys are probably very familiar with many of these names. So one thing, Gartner, I don't know if you guys follow Gartner, but one of the things that they've talked about in their one of their annual reports was procurements are often frustrated by their inability to limit cost increases at each contract level. Historically, procurement has been looked on as and saying, hey, we can negotiate the biggest discounts, the best deals, and especially in this environment now, probably a lot of SaaS providers are saying, well, inflation hit, we have to do an increase. So you're not necessarily seeing a significant amount of discounting from a lot of SaaS vendors, even if you come to them with large commitments. How many of you guys have run into this issue where your procurement team is just not getting the same discounts? Yep. So one thing about discounting, right? There's actually very common discounting traps. If anyone, how many of you guys have negotiated contracts? All right, you guys probably know all of the tricks. So for those that don't, I'm just going to mention the four things when it comes to discounting. So when you're locking in a contract, your vendor will say, hey, you'll get a discount based off of volume, term length, and if you bundle something. And oftentimes you're buying something where on a long-term contract in a bundle that you actually don't even know you're going to use in the future, right? So they're asking you to make a bet on their software, which often, I mean, let's face it, you end up losing that bet, right? There's always time frames that are missed. projects, someone introduces a new tool, and that feature that you were counting them on using, they don't use. So at the end of the day, you end up with shelfware. But these contracted licenses, all of this discounting comes in and says, hey, you guys buy all of this contracting. This is now your new contracted balance. So it's lower. You probably save, how many of you guys, raise of hands, discounting 10%. Are you usually getting 10%, 20%, 30%, 5%? You're not working hard enough if you're getting 5%. So you got these contracted licenses, right? But here's the kicker. If it's a new software that you're coming into, you actually have your actual usage, and it takes time, right? So you've committed, let's say, to buy 1,000 licenses, but those 1,000 licenses take a year to deploy. So you're now seeing that your actual cost is, or your opportunity there is a lot wider. And everything from that contracted license to the actual licenses is unused licenses, waste. So that great deal that you negotiated with, 10%, 20%, 30%, is actually not looking like a great deal, right? If you take the actual contract costs by your, the number of actual usage, you may find that your effective rate for those user licenses are the same as paying those licenses on demand, or even more, right? So you have shelfware, low utilization, and your effective rate is not looking like a good deal. So whatever you discounted, and you need to reach out to procurement and tell them that that savings that they recorded is actually not savings. You guys owe us money, and that's why there's a lot of waste there. So how do you eliminate this waste, right? So we've talked about how the SaaS and licensing has been brought back into, or has been added to the FinOps Framework. And that framework actually applies not only on the cloud spend, but you actually realize that it works really well in the SaaS environment, right? You have the inform, optimize, and then operate. You're informing, looking at reports, letting the business stakeholders know that, hey, you know what, these licenses you're using, 50% utilization. And if you tell your business owner that those licenses that they bought a year ago is only being 50% utilized, that's just going to pop open their eyes. They're going to say, well, I either need to drive up utilization or I need to essentially, in the next contracting environment, cut that out, right? And then in terms of operating that piece, how many of you do harvesting licenses on a regular basis? So you remove former employees, inactive employees, after 90 days, 30 days. Whenever there's a renewal up, you just do it. Okay, that's true, right? So if you're not doing that, you should clean up your licensing as soon as you can. So how do you avoid these discounting traps? You essentially build ladders, right? You centralize your software management as much as you can, right? Oftentimes, vendors will reach out to different business units and different people and sell them the same product, may have perhaps a different SKU and a different price. So you want to make sure you try to centralize that. You want to optimize on usage. So oftentimes we're focused on optimizing rate, right? Negotiating the best rate. But I just showed you that that best rate you negotiated actually may cost you more because of underutilization. So you want to optimize not on the rate, but optimize on the usage. Get your forecasting accurate. Realize that, hey, this new tool that I got, I'm not going to deploy it immediately to 1,000 users. It will take a certain amount of time to do that. Where you go into the planning and forecasting, right? That's very important. The first thing you really need to do is not pick up the phone or email. I guess you don't pick up the phone anymore. You just email the vendor and ask them. Rather than doing that, figure out first what you need within a certain time frame and just build that demand and forecasting plan. Benchmarking. How many of you guys have third-party benchmarking firms that you check your prices on? All right. you should do that as well, right? That's easy. Oftentimes, salespeople will say, hey, you got the best rate. And sure, yes, you trust them, but you should probably verify, right? Just make sure you're getting the best rate, and even if you're getting the best rate, ask for more. That doesn't hurt. And then, now this is a challenge, and Amy's going to go more into details about this, but being able to ingest, report, and analyze usage is very key. And you actually don't, when you're starting off, you probably don't need like a tool, right? You can do it on a monthly basis, just download the user list, put in Excel, and there you go. You got your utilization report. At Avalara, our focus primarily is on the 20% of the vendors that represent a significant amount of the usage. So we have probably about 25 vendors that we primarily focus on when we're doing optimization, because the same amount of hour to do the optimization is different for a vendor that we spend $1 million on versus a vendor we spend $10,000 on, right? So on the type of software, you just have to think about, hey, how best can I spend that 1 hour? And then the last piece is really collaborating across your organization, collaborating with the business stakeholders who own the software or the tool, and making sure that they're aware, like, hey, there's an opportunity here for us to avoid costs. Or at renewal, reduce that run rate, right, and get savings, because you have that information. And so what you end up getting through doing all of that stuff is not this line where you get, supposedly contract the full year. You actually get this step, right? And you probably are going to really piss off your AP team, because you're going to be saying, hey, you know what? I only need this amount, but in 3 months, I'm going to add to that, right? So it's operationally, it might be a pain in the butt, but you're, in terms of saving thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it may be worth it. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to talk about consumption-based SaaS.
Yeah, so this topic is, I feel, somewhat sort of at the beginning. We were just talking about licenses, but I feel like a lot of us that are maybe embedded in engineering teams or infrastructure teams are starting to really feel what's happening with consumption-based SaaS. And these can be things like Lindbergh had put up before, the different types like messaging, database as a service, your CI/CD pipeline software, analytics, observability. These are all things that are SaaS, and they're consumption-based, and they're complicated. And we're getting pulled into managing these because they're highly integrated with our applications, and they have a really high cost. And so we're starting to really see an uptick in FinOps being tapped to come in and do what we're doing with cloud, and taking that and applying it to consumption-based SaaS. So in the case of SaaS, really, it all starts with a contract. The contract is really I would say, your first data source out of anything. The contract is going to have the terms and really lay out the pricing, any limits that you might have, that type of thing. So when we look at that, in the contracts, there's different purchase methods. So SaaS is not something that's just purchased through a marketplace. You can purchase SaaS products direct from the vendor, you can go through a reseller, or you can go through the CSP marketplace, and you might there have an opportunity to even get discounts based on the method that you purchase it. So there could be some rate optimization right there, how you purchase. And then when we look at pricing, it's very much like cloud, where you typically will start with some sort of a tier, and maybe even start with a certain amount that's free, and then as you consume more, maybe the price goes down. With especially consumption-based SaaS, you're looking at multiple SKUs, and then within those SKUs, you may also be contracted for certain limits on those SKUs. And if you hit those limits, then you might be getting into overages. When you start to look at overages, more often than not, they're going to be charged at a different rate. So if you start to hit that, they might let you exceed what your limit was, but they're going to charge you at a higher rate for that. Some of them will actually start to cut off a feature if you exceed the limit. So that's why you have to really sort of scrutinize your contract to see what are the rules when you hit those limits. And then I think it's even more dangerous that some of them will let you exceed any limits that you have in place, and then they get you at the very end to true up, or maybe not even true up, but require you to create that new contract at that higher level. And then in terms of payment is really different as well. It's so varied. You could be paying different pricing monthly. A lot of the ones that I manage happen to be where you pay a lump sum all up front, and then you draw down. And then you may or may not be able to actually add more funds to the contract as the contract goes along. So those are all things that you really have to scrutinize the contract and see what are all the rules, because these are data points in your showback and your visibility that you need to include along with your usage metrics. Because if I'm looking at my usage metrics and I'm seeing trends, how do I know I'm getting close to exceeding a limit? If I don't have this contract information, I could run out and start getting charged overages and not know. So again, you don't know what you can't see. So, the very first thing getting involved with managing these products is trying to get the lay of the land, get the contract, see what all those terms are, and then pull that data together into a single pane of glass along with the usage and along with your billing data. So I just wanted to take a pause and just talk about a little bit of some differences between more license-based and consumption-based SaaS. So when we look at the type of meter that's used, these are pretty common, where a license-based is typically like user, CPU, server, et cetera, where consumption-based is by SKU typically, and there could be multiple SKUs. Most likely, they're going to have some sort of a portal, both of them. Most of them also have access to the invoices and billing. But then it comes to API access. So more mature license-based SaaS may have the ability to do this. And you know that because you have a lot of ITAM tools out there that are connecting to and ingesting that data. But when it comes to consumption-based, I feel like that's really sort of far behind. We don't have a lot of access through the APIs. Maybe they don't even have an API. And I've definitely run into that. So it's less likely today that we're seeing like APIs to get that data. And then when we look at overages, I find that even less likely to see what are those overages, and then what am I getting invoiced maybe monthly to pay those overages. And so that's some of those differences in the maturity of the tools and the maturity of the software and how they're presenting that data, I think is sort of lagging behind. When it comes to tools like SAM or ITAM tooling, again, I think the license base is a lot more mature. And there's a lot more options out there, where consumption-based, you may see it in your traditional tool, but you're really only seeing like contract level information. you're not able to actually see what does that usage look like at the SKU level? How is that trending? Versus a license where you're seeing how many of those are used and that type of thing. When you look at, this is something actually newer, other SaaS integrations. So I know of at least 2 vendors today that have released into beta the ability to pull SaaS data, cost data, from one tool into their own, making their tool sort of like the central place to be. And if this SaaS billing data is important to their customer, they're trying to import that into the tool. So this is something that we're starting to see sort of in development, especially around tools in like observability, where they're trying to bring everything together under one roof. And then obviously, a big theme here has been around focus. So this, I think, is actually going to help us with this problem with SaaS, because now we have this, we have this vehicle to get the data in this format, and now we can go and talk to the vendors and not only ask for the data, but now we can ask for it in this format. So that being said, this really, for me, has really driven the need to create custom reporting. And the reason for that is that I have not yet found a tool that can bring all this disparate information together around the contract and the contract details and the limits and the overages and the usage data. So this has really driven the need for me to create custom reports. Included in this reporting, I'm going to show you real examples. Progress towards those contract limits, overages. These could be missed really easy because they're just not available readily. And then also, I think the most important thing here is getting the visibility into the trends. So if I'm consuming an API, and maybe there's 10 different API calls, I want to be able to see the trends for each one of those. I want to be able to drill into that so that I know when my cost is going up, where can I find the source of that. And so we need to be able to have like that SKU level visibility from these products so that we can trend them just like we do with cloud. What I think is nice is that some of the more mature SaaS products have started now to build in methods for you to be able to tag data and then also allocate data. So you can create maybe a team or maybe by the application, and then you can do cost allocation within the SaaS product at that level. And you can even match that up with maybe the same strategy that you're using for cloud. And lastly, this is really the only way today to be able to bring everything together to get TCO. So, getting all of the cloud data and then bringing in all of that licensing data and your SaaS data really to be able to calculate. And when you think about products like, your CI/CD or infrastructure, those are all things that you need to include. Observability, analytics, all of these things are typically SaaS products, and those should technically be included in the calculations for TCO. So I've got a few examples here of different types of reports that I've created. These are all sanitized. This first one here is an example of a consumption-based SaaS. And what you're seeing there is 5 different SKUs. And I'm showing a month-over-month trend. And that trend is starting at the beginning of the contract in this particular example. And then the pie chart that you're seeing there is actually the progress towards the individual limits that we have contracted for that SKU. So I can see, for example, in SKU E, you can see that while I've used 67% of the limit of what I've contracted for, you can see that my trend is really drastically dropped. So even though my contract down in the lower right says 42% progress, and I've used 67% of what I contracted, I can see that usage is really dropped, and so maybe I'm not in too much trouble of hitting that limit. But getting all of this data together in one view is the only way that I'm going to be able to see this type of thing. Here's another example. This is another consumption-based product. The top is showing a monthly trend. This one is not necessarily starting from the beginning of the contract, but giving me a full 12-month view into what the usage looks like. And you can see down in the bottom, I've got the progress towards my drawdown. And you can see that in December, I've got an increase in that drawdown balance. And in the top, you can see that there's another business unit that came on board. So this gives me a way to be able to quickly visualize, here's my month-over-month trend, here's how I'm doing against my drawdown balance, and then I've got the progress of the contract itself and what percentage of the contract has gone past already. And this last one here is just a report, again, consumption-based. You can see that this is multiple SKUs. And I'm just doing a month-over-month trend. And this is really visually what I use for speaking with leadership, with engineers, to give them that visualization. But this is really the data that I use in the back end to do my forecasting. So when I'm getting ready to renew this contract, I'm looking at the SKU level. I'm talking to teams to see what they're going to be consuming. Do they have new projects that are going to increase some of the SKUs here? And this is the level of detail that I go down for a lot of these larger SaaS contracts to be able to get a little bit better at forecasting and make sure that we're not just renewing with like 10% every year and not actually digging into the usage. So these are born because I didn't really have a way to see all of this data together. And I think this is becoming, even more and more complex out there as more and more of these SaaS products are being really tightly integrated with the applications we create. And what you start to see, especially when you get a month-over-month trend like this, is, and some of them I do daily trends. I might do like a 30-day. I will actually be able to correlate the usage in my SaaS product with the usage in my application. And I can see, usage spike, and I can maybe see correlating usage spike in my SaaS product. So just like we've had with cloud, this is going to happen over and over and over again because there's thousands of SaaS products out there. And especially the consumption-based, if we don't have somebody watching, you're going to end up in this predicament over and over again with the surprise SaaS bill. And I'm sure, I'm not the only one, Lindbergh, I'm sure that you've encountered it just as much as I have.
Yeah, for sure. I think we were just dealing with a utilization bill where one of these vendors just lets you go over. And come renewal, now you're essentially saying, they're essentially saying, well, you know what, we're going to cut you off if you don't buy what you went over. And it's a challenge, right? It's not good partnership, but it's also being caught by surprise is a bit embarrassing, especially when you're talking about millions of dollars.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of this is really about education and visibility. Do you know that these things exist? I find that the ones that I work with are just really leveraged by our engineering teams, and the ITAM team might have no idea that they're using it. They might be purchasing it with a credit card, or they start out with something that's open source or freeware, and all of a sudden we have to upgrade. And then now it becomes visible. So a lot of the surprise is just not actually knowing that they exist, which is why it's really important that ITAM and FinOps collaborate, so that we can kind of cover each other. And hopefully together we'll be able to find as many of these things that are out there and be able to track them and not just keep renewing at a certain percentage every year and have all this waste sort of accumulate. So with that, just like cloud, we need we have to monitor, and we need to start alerting on trends. We start to look at anomalies, and some of the products that I work with have new features that they're actually doing anomaly detection within their own tool. But if you don't have that, then you're sort of forced into doing your own anomaly detection. And same thing I've seen where they're maybe not doing anomaly detection itself, but they allow you to set notifications if you're getting close to exceeding the limits that you agreed to, or you go above a certain threshold for usage. So they're getting better at providing you tools to manage what your usage is. You just have to leverage it, and if they don't have it, you need to start asking for it. It's the only way that we're going to be able to get a lot of these features in there. And then again, if you're doing monitoring, just like I mentioned, you'll be able to start seeing trends when you have seasonality. Big one for me is load testing. People kicking off load tests, and then I'm seeing all these SaaS products spiked because they're all tightly integrated. So when you have that visibility, then you can start to see, well, if we're doing all this testing in our dev environment, do we really need all of the logs shipped to our observability platform? Do we really need to have advanced analytics? Do we, so we can, if we have the visibility, then we can pick and choose what we have running and leave the cost incurring on-demand usage for things that we actually need for things like production. So what's next? So first of all, do you have an ITAM team? Are there any consumption-based products on their radar? So just starting that conversation is the absolute first step. I think as a working group, we provided some good guidance on how we could work together and looking at the different capabilities of the framework. But just having that conversation and sort of going through discovery, I think, is the first step. And then, are there any SaaS products integrated with your applications? And do they have good visibility? Because that's something that we're getting pretty good at with FinOps. We can apply the same things to SaaS, so we can help them with that. And then lastly, ask your SaaS providers for more options. That's the only way that we're going to get the word out. Focus, I think, is really going to help us drive that. But we need to start asking for access to our billing data that sometimes doesn't even exist in these products. So the more that we ask, hopefully the more we're going to see accessible in the products themselves. All right. we are at Q&A.
I didn't even have to prompt you for the round of applause, so thank you for that. We have time for one, maybe two questions, but I'm sure Amy and Lindbergh will be at the reception starting in just a little bit over an hour. I'll start here, and then do I have one more volunteer for a question? I'll find you and run it to you.
Perfect. I'll be quick. So it's hard to even ask this question. More in the context of showback, chargeback, not so much financial exposure, if you will, right? But in my experience, we have a lot of large enterprise agreements with a lot of, multi-SKU scenarios, very limited metering and monitoring in some of these big organizations. Not maliciously, but they do their best to prevent some of the transparency that you're talking about. I'm assuming you guys have stumbled across that situation as well. How have you tried to conquer it? Again, not from an overrun perspective, but how do I tell, certain lines of business that they're using some of this enterprise stuff that doesn't meter in the way that we'd like it to? Does that make sense?
And are you talking from like from the vendor level, or are you talking about like the engineers that are consuming this product?
So it starts at the vendor level, right, where I buy a package of SKUs at an enterprise level for $100, and each one of the SKUs is not articulated how much they really are. And then I use a bunch of that stuff, and then there's actually really no metering around it. But then I go back to an application or a business unit or whomever and say, hey, guess what? You use 10% of this enterprise thing. That's hard to do.
Yes.
Right? So have you guys encountered that, or is that a me problem?
No, it's not a you problem for sure. I had one where they literally did not provide any of that data at that level through their UI, let alone an API. I started asking for, an actual extract. I'm like, you're billing us for it, you must have it. And I started asking for the extract. Months later, after hounding them, I finally had the accessibility in the UI. And I started to notice that things didn't match. And I started asking questions, and turns out they had some sort of a calculation problem, and I ended up getting credit back because I started to scrutinize that data. So it was really me sort of pushing for getting the data that I think, that should just be, we should just be getting that data. They're billing us for it. We should be able to see that at will and be able to access it. So, getting that, I think, kind of comes back to us to really try and be a squeaky wheel and try and get them to, come back and provide us with that.
Yeah, one thing you might want to do, depending if it has SSO, is simply what I usually ask for is just a user list. The two things I ask for is a user list and the last time they logged on. And I match that data to like maybe some employee data so I know the cost center. So if it's like bundled in a way that's hard to do, at the very least, maybe there's like some sort of user list that you can grab and then allocate it that way. So, I don't know if that would work, but yeah. There's one more question.
Yeah, I'd love to know what your team structures are roughly and how you're partnering maybe with others that are owning the applications and the business around this.
Yeah, sure. So at Avalara, we actually have our FinOps team and our ITAM team. We have a dedicated FinOps person, and then a fully dedicated software asset management person, and then we have someone that floats between the two. So, yeah.
And I am a team of one. But I am embedded in the global infrastructure. So I'm really tightly coupled with them. And then by proxy, I'm also tightly coupled with all the engineering teams. So I meet with them regularly. I go to stand-ups. I'm super engaged, and I know what they're doing, at the application level. So, I think for us, a champion-type program, would be great for something that's sort of small centrally. But that's how we're operating today. Yeah.
Amy, Lindbergh, thank you again. Another
Thank you very much.
round of
Thanks,
applause.
everyone.
Thanks for watching. Check out more FinOps X 2024 content on our YouTube channel on the 2024 playlist. Support our channel by liking, subscribing, clicking the notification bell, and by leaving comments and questions for our speakers. We appreciate your support.